Snow buried the military base beneath a silent white grave, and the wind screamed across the ridgelines like something alive. Alarms echoed through the freezing air as soldiers laughed at a quiet woman carrying her final box of cleaning supplies toward the gate, having just been ordered off the base forever. No one noticed the faded tattoo hidden beneath her glove, a small mark shaped like a snowflake with a single crack running through its center. 5 minutes later, gunfire exploded across the mountains, and officers dropped one after another into the snow. Escape became impossible. Radios screamed static, and every exit seemed sealed by ice and death. Then, a single rifle cracked through the blizzard. One impossible shot tore through 2 kilometers of wind and white silence, and it erased the enemy commander in an instant. Only then did the soldiers understand that the woman they had thrown away like garbage had just saved every soul inside that base. The base sat high in the northern mountains, wrapped in a blizzard so thick that the watchtowers disappeared behind curtains of white every few minutes. Temperatures had fallen to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin in seconds. Soldiers moved from building to building with their heads down, cursing the cold, unaware that history was quietly mopping the floor of the mess hall behind them. Her name, at least the name written on her badge, was Grace Holloway, a woman said to be 45 years old, though nobody had ever bothered to ask. She spoke rarely, moved without sound, and kept her eyes low, as though she had trained herself long ago never to be noticed. The men on base did not call her by name. They called her only the janitor, and said it the way people say a word they have stopped thinking about. Grace arrived before dawn and left after dark, cleaning hallways that froze overnight and scrubbing floors that no officer ever thanked her for. A group of young soldiers had taken to dragging their muddy boots across her freshly mopped corridor just to watch her kneel down and clean it again without complaint. One lieutenant in particular, a sharp-tongued young officer named Ethan Cole, treated her presence as an insult to the base itself, muttering that cleaning staff had no place among fighting men. A new commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Reed, had just arrived to inspect the base, tightening every rule and questioning every unfamiliar face he passed in the hallways. Grace always wore gloves, even indoors, even while scrubbing floors that did not require them, and no one thought to ask why a woman who mopped floors needed such thick leather across her hands. At night, after the last generator hummed down into silence, Grace often lingered near the eastern hallway long after her duties were finished, standing before a small plaque bolted into the concrete wall. She never touched it, never lit a candle beneath it the way some soldiers did for fallen friends, only stood there in the dark for a few quiet minutes before returning to her small room near the supply closet. The younger soldiers who noticed this habit assumed she was simply strange, another eccentric civilian drawn to a military base for reasons no one bothered to question. They joked about her sometimes in the mess hall, inventing stories about a woman too plain and too quiet to have ever lived an interesting life before mopping their floors. None of them noticed that her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, sometimes tracked the movement of wind through the trees beyond the fence with an attention that had nothing to do with weather. It was the kind of watching a hunter does without meaning to, an old reflex worn so deep into the body that even years of silence could not fully erase it. Once, when her glove slipped slightly while she reached for a fallen mop, a young private caught a glimpse of her left hand, crossed with old white scars that ran too deep and too precise to be accidents. He said nothing, assuming perhaps an old kitchen injury, and looked away out of simple politeness. Yet something about those scars lingered in his mind for the rest of the day, a small detail that refused to fit the picture of a harmless old woman with a mop. Colonel Reed, standing at the end of the hallway with a clipboard in hand, watched Grace disappear around the corner and turned to his aide with a flat, dismissive voice. Budget cuts had come down from command, he said, and civilian staff were the easiest expense to eliminate before winter deepened further. He did not know her name, did not care to learn it, and gave the order without hesitation or a second glance. "Remove her from the base today," he said, already turning his attention to the next item on his list, unaware that he had just ordered the base's last line of defense to walk out the front gate. By mid-morning, word of the decision had reached every corner of the base, carried mostly by soldiers who found it mildly amusing. Grace was called into the administration office and told, without ceremony, that her contract had been terminated effective immediately due to civilian staffing cuts. The officer delivering the news barely looked up from his paperwork, sliding a form across the desk for her signature as though dismissing a piece of furniture. Lieutenant Cole happened to be passing through the office at that exact moment, and he could not resist adding his own remark to the humiliation already unfolding. "This is a military base, not a charity," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, expecting laughter and receiving a few uncomfortable chuckles in return. Grace said nothing in response. She simply nodded once, took the pen, signed her name in small, steady letters, and folded the paper without another word. She returned to her small storage room near the eastern wing and began packing what little she owned into a single cardboard box. There was not much to gather. A few clean rags, a chipped coffee thermos she had carried for years, and a metal ID badge that no longer meant anything now sat at the bottom of the box, waiting to be sealed away. Beneath these ordinary items, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth, lay a photograph so faded that the faces within it had nearly dissolved into gray shadow. It showed a small group of soldiers standing in deep snow, rifles slung over their shoulders, all smiling except for one figure whose image had been carefully, deliberately torn away. No one on base ever saw that photograph, and no one thought to ask what unit those faces belonged to, or why one person had been erased so completely from the memory it preserved. Grace tucked it back beneath the cloth, closed the box, and carried it toward the front gate without looking back at the buildings she had spent years cleaning in silence. She had learned, long before she ever set foot on this base, that grief was easier to carry when no one could see its shape. The torn edge of that photograph had been made by her own hand, years earlier, in a moment she rarely allowed herself to remember in full. Some nights, she thought she should have burned it entirely rather than keep a wound folded inside a coffee-stained cloth. Yet something in her had never been able to let the last of him go. As she crossed the courtyard with the box balanced against her hip, a few soldiers glanced her way and then quickly looked elsewhere, uncomfortable in the presence of a dismissal they had helped cause through months of small cruelties. The cold bit through her thin jacket, but Grace did not hurry, walking instead with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to every task assigned to her. She had survived far colder places than this parking lot, and far crueler dismissals than a colonel's clipboard signature. Outside, the storm had grown heavier, swallowing the guard towers in swirling white and turning the world beyond the fence into a formless gray wall. Soldiers on duty barely glanced at the woman walking past them with a cardboard box pressed against her chest, just another anonymous figure leaving through the gate before the weather worsened. Grace stepped past the checkpoint, her boots crunching into fresh snow, and paused for only a moment to glance back at the base that had never once said her real name. Nothing in her expression suggested urgency or fear, only the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago how to disappear into ordinary moments. Then, cutting through the howling wind, an alarm began to wail across the entire base, sharp and sudden, the kind of sound that made every soldier freeze mid-step. Red lights flashed against the falling snow, turning the whitewashed walls into pulses of crimson, and somewhere deep inside the command center, radar screens filled with static that should never have appeared. Grace did not walk faster toward her car. Instead, she turned her head slowly back toward the mountains, and for the first time, something behind her eyes shifted into a stillness no janitor's uniform could explain. Inside the command center, chaos erupted within seconds as radar operators struggled to make sense of screens that had gone completely blind. Every channel of communication dissolved into static, as though something had deliberately severed the base from the outside world in a single coordinated strike. Colonel Reed rushed in demanding answers, but no one had any to give him, only the sickening realization that they were now fighting an enemy they could not see, hear, or track. High on the ridgeline above the base, hidden within the storm itself, an enemy sniper team had already taken position, invisible against the churning white backdrop of the blizzard. One by one, officers moving between buildings began to fall, struck by bullets that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Panic spread through the base like fire through dry grass, soldiers diving for cover behind barricades that offered no real protection against an enemy hidden inside a storm. Attempts to launch reconnaissance drones failed almost immediately, the aircraft either freezing mid-flight or losing signal entirely within the thick, swirling snow. The base's own sniper unit scrambled to the rooftops, searching desperately for a target, but the storm blinded them just as thoroughly as it blinded everyone else. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as more soldiers fell, the enemy shifting positions with unnerving precision despite conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. At the front gate, Grace stood frozen beside her old car, watching the chaos unfold with an expression that had nothing to do with fear. Her eyes moved slowly up toward the mountain ridge, tracing invisible lines through the storm as though she could see something no one else could. For the first time since arriving at that base, something ancient and sharp surfaced behind her calm expression. A flicker of recognition that belonged to a woman who had once lived and breathed exactly this kind of war. It was the look of a legend waking from a very long sleep. 25 years earlier, in a war that most soldiers on this base had only read about in training manuals, a young sniper had built a reputation that bordered on myth. Her name back then was still Grace, though few outside her unit ever used it, preferring instead the name whispered with equal parts fear and awe across enemy lines. They called her the Winter Ghost, a title earned through a record that seemed almost impossible to believe, for in 3 years of active combat, she had never once missed a shot. Snowstorms, sandstorms, moving targets beyond a mile away. Nothing seemed to disturb the terrifying stillness with which she calculated distance, wind, and the fragile rhythm of a heartbeat before pulling the trigger. Her unit trusted her completely, and among that small circle of soldiers, one man in particular had become far more than a comrade in arms. His name was Daniel Foster, a demolition specialist with an easy laugh and steady hands, the only person who ever saw Grace smile without effort. Their final mission together was meant to be simple, a quiet extraction deep behind enemy lines that should have taken less than a day to complete. Instead, someone within their own command structure had leaked their position, and the extraction turned into an ambush that shattered the unit within minutes. Daniel had pushed Grace toward the extraction point, taking the brunt of enemy fire meant for her, and had not survived long enough to see her escape the valley alive. Grace fought her way out alone, wounded and half-frozen, carrying wounds both physical and invisible that no medic could ever fully repair. When she finally reached friendly territory days later, delirious and barely alive, the official reports had already listed her as killed in action, a clerical convenience that no one bothered to correct. Rather than reveal herself and reclaim a name soaked in grief and betrayal, Grace let the world believe the Winter Ghost had died in that valley alongside the only man she had ever loved. She wandered for years afterward, drifting between towns and jobs that meant nothing, until something pulled her back toward the very base where Daniel's memory now lived only as a small plaque near the eastern wall. She applied for a position no one else wanted, cleaning floors and scrubbing hallways in a place still haunted by a war that history books had already begun to forget. The pay was small, the recognition non-existent, but it placed her close enough to walk past that plaque every single morning, close enough to remember without anyone asking why. Grace built a life out of silence, choosing invisibility as both a shield and a quiet form of penance for surviving when Daniel had not. She never spoke of snipers, wars, or ghosts, letting the world see only a tired woman with a mop and a pair of gloves that never came off. Now, standing at the gate with alarms shrieking behind her and gunfire tearing through the mountains ahead, that carefully built silence finally began to crack. There had been offers, over the years, from old commanders who somehow learned she was still alive and quietly reached out through back channels, hoping to bring the Winter Ghost back into active service. She refused every one of them without exception, unwilling to carry a rifle again for any cause that was not entirely her own. Grief had taught her that skill without purpose was simply another kind of weapon pointed inward, and she had no interest in becoming a tool for someone else's war a second time. The base had never known any of this, had never suspected that the woman emptying their trash bins had once briefed generals and trained soldiers twice her rank in techniques still classified decades later. She kept a single photograph, kept a single tattoo hidden beneath a glove, and kept a single promise she had made to herself in a hospital bed years earlier, that she would never again let anyone she loved fall while she stood close enough to prevent it. That promise, buried for 25 years beneath mops and rags and quiet mornings, now rose back to the surface with the force of an avalanche breaking loose. The mountain had called her back, and this time, she intended to answer fully. Grace turned from the chaos at the gate and walked calmly to her old car, parked at the edge of the lot beneath a thin blanket of fresh snow. She opened the trunk without hesitation, revealing a false panel beneath a stack of worn blankets, a hiding place built years earlier for exactly this kind of moment. Underneath lay a steel case, dulled by time and dust, its lock still intact despite decades of neglect and the passage of an entire life lived under a different name. Her hands, steady despite the freezing wind, worked the combination from memory alone, muscle memory outlasting every year she had spent trying to forget it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, rested a rifle unlike anything currently issued to soldiers on that base, older, heavier, and built for a kind of precision modern equipment rarely demanded anymore. She lifted it free of the case and held it for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight settle into her arms like an old friend returning after a long absence. Grace wiped away years of dust with slow, deliberate strokes, each movement precise despite hands that trembled slightly from the cold and from memory. She checked the barrel, the scope, and the firing mechanism with the calm thoroughness of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times before ever losing the habit. From a smaller compartment within the case, she retrieved a worn leather harness and slipped it over her shoulders, adjusting each strap until the rifle rested exactly where her body remembered it should. One by one, she inspected the rounds she carried, holding each cartridge briefly to the gray light before loading it carefully into the weapon. No words passed her lips throughout this entire process, only the sound of wind screaming across the parking lot and the faint metallic click of a rifle being prepared for war. When she finally closed the case and slung the rifle fully into place, something in her posture had transformed entirely. The tired janitor replaced by a soldier the base had never known it employed. She moved away from the gate and toward the tree line bordering the base, choosing a path that avoided the panicked soldiers still scrambling for cover near the main buildings. The slope leading up toward the ridge was steep and treacherous, buried under snow deep enough to swallow a careless foot entirely. But Grace climbed it with the sure-footed patience of someone who had once made mountains her second home. She paused periodically, reading the wind through subtle shifts in falling snow, calculating angles and distances that existed only in her mind, invisible to anyone without decades of training behind their eyes. No radio crackled at her ear, no spotter called out corrections, only the old, familiar silence she had learned to trust more than any piece of modern equipment. Halfway up the ridge, she found a natural outcropping of rock that offered both cover and a clear line toward the valley below, exactly the kind of position her instincts had led her toward without conscious thought. Settling into the snow, she raised the rifle to her shoulder, closed one eye, and allowed the storm around her to fade into a single, narrow tunnel of focus. The winter ghost had returned to the mountains, and this time, she carried no unit behind her, only a debt she intended to repay in full. Below, the enemy sniper team continued shifting positions with practiced efficiency, using the blizzard as both weapon and shelter against a base that had no answer for their tactics. They rotated between prepared firing points scattered across the ridge, striking quickly before vanishing again into curtains of falling snow before return fire could ever locate them. Grace watched this pattern unfold from her position, patient despite the freezing wind cutting through her jacket, studying rhythms that untrained eyes would have dismissed as random chaos. She identified the spotter first, a barely visible shape crouched behind a rock formation roughly 1 mile distant, relaying coordinates through a radio she could not hear but could clearly imagine. Calculating wind drift, elevation, and the brief pause between gusts, Grace exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger, sending a single round tearing silently through the storm. The spotter dropped instantly, and for a moment, confusion rippled visibly through the enemy positions as they scrambled to determine what had happened and from where. Grace shifted her position slightly, relocating with practiced silence before the enemy could triangulate her original firing point, a discipline that had kept her alive through countless similar engagements decades earlier. Her next target was the radio operator. Positioned slightly higher on the ridge, his silhouette betrayed only by a faint reflection off frozen equipment he had failed to properly conceal. Another shot cracked through the wind, swallowed almost entirely by the storm's howling voice, and the radio operator collapsed without ever understanding what had ended him. Panic began spreading visibly among the remaining enemy soldiers, their coordinated movements fracturing into confused, scattered repositioning as an invisible threat picked them apart one by one. They had trained for combat against soldiers, against drones, against conventional resistance, but nothing had prepared them for a ghost hunting them silently through a storm of her own making. A third shot removed the deputy commander attempting to rally his scattering unit, further collapsing whatever coordination remained among the enemy forces still holding the ridge. Confusion turned rapidly into fear, soldiers whispering among themselves about an enemy sniper impossibly precise despite conditions that should have made accurate shooting nearly unattainable for anyone. Grace remained motionless between shots, her breathing slow and controlled, ice forming along the edges of her hood as she waited patiently for each fleeting opportunity. Every kill reduced the enemy's ability to communicate, coordinate, or execute whatever larger plan had brought them to this remote mountain base in the first place. Down at the base itself, soldiers began noticing the shift in enemy fire, the sudden gaps in coordinated attacks, though none understood yet that a single woman on the ridge above them had turned the tide of battle entirely alone. Colonel Reed, watching through a cracked window of the command center, could only wonder aloud who or what had begun dismantling the enemy assault with such terrifying precision. High above, hidden within the storm, Grace prepared for the encounter she somehow already sensed was coming, the true architect behind this entire assault still waiting somewhere on that ridge. Below, in the barracks nearest the eastern wall, wounded soldiers were being dragged behind overturned tables while medics worked frantically with hands numbed by cold and adrenaline in equal measure. Lieutenant Cole, the same young officer who had mocked Grace only hours earlier, found himself pinned behind a supply crate, his weapon trembling in hands that had never faced live fire before that morning. He kept glancing toward the ridge where the enemy fire had originated, unable to understand why the attacks had suddenly grown sporadic, then desperate, then increasingly rare. Around him, seasoned soldiers who had trained for years still could not mask the fear tightening across their faces, aware that whatever had been picking off the enemy was still unknown, still unseen, still entirely outside their control. For the first time since the alarm had sounded, a fragile hope began moving through the base, quiet and uncertain, the kind of hope that comes only after unbearable dread has already worn a person down to nothing. No one yet dared to say it aloud, but something out there in the storm seemed to be fighting for them rather than against them. Through fractured radio intercepts finally captured by the base's struggling systems, officers below began piecing together a horrifying picture of what remained at stake. The enemy commander, having lost his spotter, his communications, and several key subordinates, was now preparing a final and devastating contingency plan. Hidden deeper within the ridge, protected by rock formations that had shielded it from detection throughout the entire engagement, sat a portable missile launcher aimed directly at the heart of the base. If fired successfully, it carried enough destructive force to erase every remaining structure and every soul still sheltering within them, ending the battle in a single, catastrophic strike. Grace, watching through her scope from a slightly elevated position, spotted the commander moving toward the launcher with unmistakable urgency, his intentions clear even through swirling curtains of snow. She checked her remaining ammunition and found only a single round left in her weapon, the storm having worsened to a point where visibility had dropped to mere meters. Everything now depended entirely on one shot, fired blind through conditions that would have made even the most seasoned marksman question whether success was possible at all. Wind screamed across the ridge with a violence that seemed determined to erase every trace of the world beneath layers of relentless white. Grace steadied her breathing, closing her eyes briefly against the sting of ice crystals, allowing memory rather than sight to guide her final calculations. In that fleeting darkness behind closed eyes, she heard Daniel's voice again, calm and certain, the way it had sounded years earlier during a similarly impossible shot they had once planned together. "One shot is enough," he had told her then, and she repeated those words silently now, letting them settle into her chest like a promise finally being honored. She opened her eyes, found the faint silhouette of the commander through a narrow gap in the storm, and adjusted her aim according to instincts sharpened across decades she had tried desperately to forget. The world around her narrowed into a single, perfect point of stillness, wind and cold and fear all fading beneath the weight of absolute focus. Grace exhaled fully, felt the natural pause between heartbeats, and pulled the trigger one final time. For one long, suspended moment, nothing existed beyond the narrow tunnel of her focus. Not the cold biting at her fingers, not the ache settling deep into her shoulder, not even the memory of Daniel that had carried her this far up the mountain. Every year of silence, every mopped floor, every insult swallowed without complaint funneled itself into that single instant balanced on the edge of a trigger. The bullet tore through the storm with a violence that defied the very conditions meant to make such a shot impossible, closing the distance in a fraction of a second no one below could measure. It struck the enemy commander precisely as his hand reached toward the launcher's activation switch, ending both the threat and the man in a single, decisive instant. The missile, deprived of its final command sequence, sputtered briefly before veering wildly off course, crashing harmlessly into an empty section of the mountainside far from the base. Silence followed almost immediately, the kind of heavy, disorienting silence that only comes after prolonged chaos suddenly and completely ceases. Remaining enemy forces, already demoralized and leaderless, began retreating hastily down the far side of the ridge, abandoning positions they no longer had any will or reason to hold. Inside the base, Soldiers slowly emerged from cover, disbelief written across every face as they realized the attack had somehow, impossibly, ended. No one yet understood who had delivered them from near certain destruction, only that somewhere above them, in a storm no living thing should have survived, a single act of impossible skill had just saved every life within those walls. As the storm finally began to weaken, reinforcement units dispatched from a nearby outpost arrived by helicopter, cutting through thinning clouds to survey the aftermath of an attack already largely resolved. Search teams fanned out across the ridge, following faint tracks in the snow that led them toward a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley below. There, seated calmly against the stone with her back straight, despite obvious exhaustion, they found a woman none of them immediately recognized, her rifle resting quietly across her lap. Frost clung to her eyelashes, and blood from a shallow wound along her arm had already begun freezing against torn fabric, yet her expression remained utterly composed. A soldier approached cautiously, unsure whether he had discovered an ally or a threat, until he noticed the base's own visitor badge still clipped, absurdly, to her jacket. Word spread quickly through radio channels, reaching command just as a military helicopter carrying a senior officer descended toward the base's central courtyard. From within that helicopter stepped a decorated general named Walter Briggs, whose reaction upon seeing the woman being escorted down from the ridge stunned every soldier gathered to witness it. General Briggs walked directly toward Grace without hesitation, ignoring protocol, ignoring rank, ignoring the confused murmurs rippling through the assembled soldiers around him. He stopped before her, studied her face for a long, silent moment, and then, to the astonishment of everyone present, snapped to full attention and offered a formal salute. Soldiers who moments earlier had mocked her, ignored her, or dismissed her entirely now stood frozen in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the image before them with the woman they thought they knew. "Welcome home, Captain," General Briggs said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the wind still tugging at his coat. The words hung in the freezing air like a verdict, reshaping in an instant everything the base had believed about their quiet, invisible janitor. Colonel Reed, standing near the entrance to the command building, felt the ground shift beneath years of careless assumptions he had never once thought to question. Grace Holloway, it seemed, had never truly been a janitor at all, and the truth now unfolding threatened to rewrite the entire history of that remote mountain base. Within hours, classified files long buried beneath layers of bureaucratic secrecy were unsealed and delivered directly to Colonel Reed's desk, their contents leaving him visibly shaken. The documents revealed a service record so extraordinary that officers gathered around simply to read it, their earlier dismissiveness replaced now by disbelief and quiet shame. Grace had once led an elite sniper training program, shaping some of the military's most capable marksmen during a period when her methods were considered legendary among specialized units. Her operational record credited her, directly or indirectly, with saving the lives of thousands of soldiers across numerous missions too sensitive to ever be publicly acknowledged. She had received a classified commendation for actions during her final deployment, an honor she had personally requested be sealed away from public record following her disappearance. After her supposed death was recorded and quietly accepted by command, Grace had petitioned, through channels few knew existed, to have her file permanently expunged from active service records. The reason behind her decision to remain at this particular base, of all places, finally became clear to everyone who read further into the file's final pages. A small addendum noted that she had specifically requested reassignment near a memorial dedicated to soldiers lost during a mission designated only by a case number, one that included the name Daniel Foster among its listed casualties. Lieutenant Cole, the very officer who had mocked her openly just hours earlier, stood at the back of the gathered crowd with tears streaming freely down his face. He pushed forward through the assembled soldiers until he stood directly before Grace, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved into raw, unguarded shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of everything he now understood about the woman he had insulted without thought. Grace looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, before offering only a small, tired smile that carried no trace of anger or resentment. Whatever bitterness she might once have felt toward careless young officers seemed to have burned away entirely somewhere on that mountain ridge, alongside 25 years of carefully guarded silence. Colonel Reed, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, found it difficult to meet her eyes even as he attempted to formally apologize for the order he had given without a second thought. He admitted, in front of every soldier present, that he had judged her worth by a job title alone, never once pausing to consider the life a person might carry beneath something as ordinary as a mop and a set of gloves. Other soldiers came forward in the hours that followed, some offering quiet apologies, others simply standing near her in silence, unsure how to reconcile years of careless dismissal with the woman now being called a hero. Grace accepted none of it with bitterness, choosing instead to treat each apology the way she had treated every insult before it, with a calm, unhurried grace that seemed to disarm even the most guilt-ridden among them. She understood, perhaps better than anyone on that base, how easily people mistook silence for emptiness, and how rarely anyone thought to look beneath the surface of someone who asked for nothing. It was not forgiveness she offered them exactly, but something closer to release, a quiet permission to stop carrying guilt for a mistake that could still, in the end, be corrected. The base had failed to see her once. It would not make that mistake again. 2 days later, once the storm had finally passed and clear skies stretched endlessly over the mountains, the entire base gathered for a formal ceremony held near the eastern memorial wall. The flag, lowered briefly during the chaos of battle, now rose slowly back to full height, snapping crisply in the cold morning wind. Soldiers stood in perfect formation, their earlier laughter and casual disregard replaced by a solemn respect none of them could have imagined feeling just days before. Colonel Reed personally presented Grace with her original rank insignia, restored after decades of quiet erasure, the silver bars catching sunlight as he pinned them carefully onto her jacket. General Briggs offered her formal reinstatement into active service, along with command of a new specialized training division built specifically around her legendary expertise. Grace listened respectfully, her posture straight and composed, before responding with words that would be repeated throughout that base for years afterward. "A soldier never stops serving," she said simply, "only changes where she stands," declining the offer with the same quiet certainty that had defined every choice she had made since Daniel's death. Rather than returning to active military command, Grace requested only a small, symbolic gesture that surprised everyone who expected her to demand far more after everything she had sacrificed. Colonel Reed presented her with the key to a newly designated honor room within the base, a modest space intended to preserve the memory of those who had served in silence and sacrifice alike. Her name, alongside Daniel's, was formally engraved onto the base's Wall of Heroes, a monument previously reserved only for those whose stories command had deemed worthy of remembrance. Soldiers who once walked past that eastern wall without a second glance now paused deliberately, reading names they had never bothered to learn before that winter storm changed everything. As the ceremony concluded and soldiers slowly dispersed back toward their duties, snow began falling gently once more, soft and quiet compared to the violence of days earlier. Grace remained standing near the memorial a while longer, her eyes resting on Daniel's name, her lips moving silently in words meant only for him. Whatever peace she had been searching for since that fateful mission 25 years earlier seemed, at last, to have settled quietly into place around her. General Briggs offered her one final gesture before departing that afternoon, a formal letter restoring her full pension and benefits, along with an open invitation to return to any base in the country, should she ever change her mind about active service. Grace accepted the letter politely, folded it without reading it twice, and tucked it into the same coat pocket where she had once kept a torn photograph for over 2 decades. She had no need for grand titles or renewed command, having already found, quite by accident, the only kind of purpose that had ever truly mattered to her. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and standing watch over a fallen soldier's memory, she had built a life that no medal could improve and no rank could diminish. The base, for its part, would never again mistake silence for weakness, nor overlook the quiet figures moving unnoticed through its hallways, mopping floors and asking nothing in return. Word of what happened on that ridge spread slowly through military circles in the weeks that followed, whispered with the same reverence once reserved for the legend of the Winter Ghost decades earlier. And though Grace never sought recognition beyond that single brass plaque near the honor room door, her story became, quietly and permanently, part of the mountain itself. In the days that followed, a young private assigned to maintenance duties took it upon himself to care for a small brass plaque recently installed near the entrance of the honor room. He polished it carefully each morning, the metal gleaming beneath careful, respectful strokes, treating the task with a reverence entirely different from the reluctant labor Grace had once performed unnoticed. The plaque read simply, in clean engraved letters, Captain Grace Holloway, followed by a smaller inscription beneath her name that soldiers would pause to read every time they passed. It stated plainly that the janitor they had dismissed had become the guardian who saved every soul within that base, a truth none among them would ever forget again. Grace herself remained at the base only briefly after the ceremony, choosing eventually to leave quietly, the same way she had once arrived, without fanfare or announcement. On a clear winter morning, with dawn breaking gently over snow-covered peaks, she walked toward the gate one final time, carrying nothing but a small bag and the same steady calm that had defined her throughout her time there. Soldiers who once ignored her presence now stood along her path in silent, unspoken tribute, some offering respectful nods, others simply watching as the legend among them departed. No one called her the janitor any longer, that dismissive title having dissolved entirely beneath the weight of everything they now understood about the woman who had walked among them unnoticed for so long. She paused briefly at the gate, glancing back one final time at the base bathed in soft morning light, its walls forever changed by a truth that had nearly been discarded alongside a box of cleaning supplies. Then Grace Holloway turned and walked forward into the winter dawn, her footsteps leaving quiet marks across fresh, untouched snow. Behind her remained a base transformed, a wall bearing her name alongside the man she had loved and lost, and a story that would be retold for generations among those who had witnessed it firsthand. She was no longer merely a name written on an old badge, nor a quiet figure pushing a mop through empty hallways. She was, at last, and forever, remembered exactly as she deserved to be. Captain Grace Holloway, the winter ghost, the guardian who saved every soul. Somewhere far below, past the tree line and beyond the reach of any watchtower, her footprints eventually faded beneath fresh snowfall, the way all footprints eventually do. Yet the mark she left on that base would not fade so easily, carried forward in the posture of soldiers who now stood a little straighter and in the quiet respect they offered every stranger whose story they did not yet know. Somewhere, a young private still polished a small brass plaque each morning, taking care with a name that had once meant nothing to him and now meant everything. And somewhere on a distant road, wrapped against the cold in a plain wool coat, a woman walked on into the pale winter light, carrying no rifle, no rank, and no need for anyone to recognize her at all.